What you're about to hear is an interview with Jason Lorefice, author of the Vermont Encounters and Beyond, also a very good friend of mine. Joining me to help is my friend Alan, and together we asked Jason about his knowledge and experience with Bigfoot, or Sasquatch. I hope you enjoy the Everything Horror Podcast episode. What's up, everybody, and welcome back to the show. And with us today, well, we got a buddy of mine first that is going to be helping me out with this one particular topic. Please welcome Alan. Alan, thank you for joining.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Excited you're welcome.
Get into it.
Definitely. And for those that may not know, we have a author here that I believe has put out his book for almost 4 years now, and it is known as the Vermont Bigfoot Encounters and Beyond. And this is Jason Lorefice.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, you're very welcome. And, you know, this is a very interesting topic anyway, because it is Bigfoot related, and if not a little bit more that we could get into, because you did have a bonus chapter in your book. And it's definitely going to be interesting to see if there's anything new that we can scratch your head from the couple years that we haven't really talked and gotten together. So it would be great. Now, real quick, Jason, I know you had your experience before the book came out. And for those that are listening, you also were a paranormal investigator at one point. So can you kind of give us a brief description about who you kind of are and how you were into the whole paranormal before you kind of switched over to the Bigfoot?
So I was one of the founding members of PINE, which is Paranormal Investigators of New England. Jeff Stewart is the founding father of that group. I was one of the original founding members of that back in 2004. We mostly covered ghosts, hauntings, paranormal stuff when we were doing that cases, but on the side, I was actually doing my own crypto work. As far as the whole topic of Bigfoot, I've always had an interest in the subject ever since I was a little kid, but, you know, never in a million years did I actually perceive myself as actually going out into the field and investigating this kind of thing, but, you know, one thing led to another, and I just happened to take interest in some of the reports that were happening in Vermont and New York, and I was pursuing them on the side, and I eventually kind of slowly drifted away from the paranormal, the PINE group, and they continued on doing their thing, and I just happened to just take more of an interest in the subject of Bigfoot and cryptozoology to the point where I just dove in and invested most of my free time in this subject.
Yeah, and you've done quite a bit too. And I mean, I know we met up and stuff, and we talked about it, especially the very well-known photo of the Vermont trail cam here in Vermont that was taken, I believe, in 2012.
10.
Or 10, right? That's what I meant.
That was a trail cam taken out down in Hubbardton by a guy named Frank Cienski. He noticed that something was stealing his apples in his own property, and he wasn't thinking Bigfoot. He was thinking, you know, maybe it was one of the locals or neighbors in the neighborhood. So he decided to set up a trail cam and catch whoever it is that was doing that. He left it up there for 7 days, 7 nights, and when he finally took it down, he was starting to review the footage, and he captured that particular image, and I guess the rest is history. He submitted it to certain groups. I think there was the Vermont Fish and Wildlife. He submitted it to those guys, and they came back with the most ridiculous excuse of that it was an owl. Well, I didn't know owls get to be 600 pounds or more, and he submitted it to one person in particular. I guess he was out in the UK. He analyzed that. He was a computer analyst, and he said, no, that's not an owl, and he was able to determine that the object in question was a good distance away from the camera, and he wasn't able to say, definitively as to what it is. He just labeled it as a unknown, which is good, but the object in question was a lot larger than an average human. So, the people out there can draw their own conclusion.
True with that, especially it was also featured on the Finding Bigfoot TV show where they even tried to debunk the photo themselves, which they really couldn't because they just weren't, if I might say, wide enough, because it definitely seemed like whatever was in the photo was so much larger and had width to it, so that when they tried to draw out a line to show us where the Bigfoot in the photo, if that's what it is, of course, but we say it is, but because it also seems like it was also carrying possibly a young, and it just, between a human and the outline they kind of gave that photo, there's no way in hell it comes close to the outline of that photo.
Right. And this guy got so many calls after that. Once the thing went viral. I mean, he got calls from people in Russia, believe it or not, interested in that case, and he got people from Florida, California, South America, from all over different parts of the globe. He was getting inquiries from people, including the show Finding Bigfoot. Even did an episode on him one day. This was back in 2012, I think they did the episode. And since then, people have been kind of discriminating against it, saying, well, no, it's not that, it's this, it's two wolves fighting, it's a bear, it's, anywhere from a person in a costume to, the tooth fairy, but, whatever they say, no one has been able to definitively prove what it is or what it isn't. You know what I mean?
Right, and and it's also interesting where we also hear reports of Bigfoot where they like to go to places where there's apples, whether it be in apples on the ground, in the tree, no matter what, but it's always seems to be around apple orchards, or any type of apples, really, even if it's just wild apples. Now, out of curiosity, Jason, why do you think Bigfoots like to be around apples, really?
Well, I think it's just an easy meal for them. And Whitehall, New York, if you drive into Whitehall from Vermont and you're going in through Route 4, and you take a look on the left, right-hand side while you're going in, you're going to see at least 4 or 5 different apple orchards on the way in there. And along the way, that's just along the side of the route. Now, there's also apple orchards set back further into the town, which you'll never see because it's on private property. Apples tend to grow. They bloom a little bit later on in the year. They tend to start, blooming around July, August, September. They're pretty much done by October. Whereas a lot of the plant life seems to be, finishing their cycle for that year. But apples are a good source of energy. They provide a lot of vitamins and nutrients. So, and, when it comes to the human element, I mean, a lot of people enjoy them. I mean, I myself personally have them. But as far as a food source, that really is, the ideal food source you need when you're traveling around from going from one area to the next, because they don't stay in one area, they migrate. And if they know that there's a food source such as corn, apple orchards, or any kind of vegetation in that area, they're going to frequent the area on a given time of the year.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so Jason, I had a question for you. How do you find in all your research the characteristics of Sasquatch or Bigfoot in the Vermont area differ from ones that you find in other parts of the U.S. or around the world in your own research?
Yeah, they don't really differ from all the rest of the parts of the United States, except for the fact that here in New England we have 4 seasons, so they have to plan accordingly like any other species in the wilderness, whereas to migrate during certain times of the year, whereas if you're living down in, say, Florida, you have the Florida skunk ape down in the Everglades. They tend to linger around in an area most of the year because that's their primary source of food, whereas when you have an area such as New England in the Four Seasons area, you tend to live your life a little different than you would down south. Now, out in California, in the Pacific Northwest, again, you're in an area that has heavy rainfall. And what we notice about these creatures, what they all have in common is they tend to make their habitat in areas that have heavy rainfall each year annually. And New England and the Pacific Northwest are the prime areas for that. Now, if you go into the Midwest, in the center of the United States, like, I'm going to say someplace like Kansas, where, sightings around there tend to be few and far between. And then again, the climate area in that area tends to be a little bit more drier, so you get fewer annual rainfall in that area. Well, in a creature such as this, something as large as 8-9 feet in height, 600 pounds plus, you're going to need a lot of water to keep yourself hydrated. So it makes perfect sense to live in an area such as New England. Right.
Have you found a difference in physical descriptions? There's obviously there tends to be some discrepancy in certain areas, or different types of Sasquatch that people find in different parts. Do the ones in Vermont? What I don't know if you go by some of the types, like the type 1, 2, 3, and 4, or more than that, or what physical characteristics do you find in Vermont?
As far as the types, I think I found myself personal research that there's at least 5 different types of them out there. Now there could be more, but as far as the type 1, 2, and 3, 4, and 5, I guess it all depends on the individual and how they label them. Type 3 tends to be the most common one that they see. Type 1 would be your Yeti, your abominable snowman. These creatures tend to be more ape-like in appearance. They have more of a chimpanzee or baboon type look to them. They do walk upright. They're not what we call knuckle walkers. They have a height of around 6 to 7 feet. They tend to be more aggressive prone. Now, type 2, I'm going to say the swamp dwellers myself. This is what you would call this is your Florida Everglades, or your skunk ape. Again, these tend to be more ape-like, or more like a type of a primate type of appearance to them. Less of a human, more of an ape. And again, these down at the Florida Everglades, we get footprints that have only 3 toes to them, and that kind of threw a lot of researchers off over the years, because the question is, why only 3 digits on a foot, where most of these creatures, such as humans, have 5 toes. So the theory about the aquatic ape comes into play. That's never been proven or disproven. But when you go out to, say, Ohio, they have something called the Ohio Grassman, and there's a lot of swampy regions down there. Again, they've been finding 3-toed footprints in that area. If you take a trip out to the Falk, Arkansas, where they had the monster of Boggy Creek, again, that creature has been infamously known to leave 3-toed tracks. Type 3 is what you call your average Bigfoot Sasquatch. And type 3, you got type 3 and 4, they kind of have a discrepancy between the two. One of them has been reported to see the more of a conical shaped head, where it's kind of more, the the cranium becomes more pointed at the top.
Right.
We don't always get that. Sometimes it's a rounded skull, so that gives you two different types right there. Also, the type 3 and 4 tend to be more human-like in appearance. More human, less of an ape, less of a primate. They tend to vary in different hair color, and I think that's just a simple of different, pigmentation, just like we have blonde-haired people, brunette hairs and redheads and so forth. Now, as far as the tracks that we get some of them have what they call a mid-tarsal break, which is that extra hinge joint that humans don't have. Again, we don't always get that, so you get those two different types in there. Type 5 is more of a, it tends to be more, maybe a canine-looking look to them, because the people that have seen them, now I've never seen the Type 5 before, but people have described them as the ears on the side become more larger and more pointed on the side, whereas the chin and jaw tends to protrude outward a little bit more, giving it a more of a human appearance in eyes, but more of an animalistic look from the lower half of the jaw, if that makes any sense.
Right.
Now, the question is, do they interbreed? If so, then, well, now you have maybe a type 6 and 7 of them. But that's just theory and speculation.
Right. Yeah, I've also heard there's also been obviously theories about inbreeding and also, I guess, track awareness, where they're sort of backtracking and altering the shapes of their tracks, in trying to throw people off. Have you looked into any theories about that at all, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've heard those before. They're extremely intelligent. I mean, obviously they have to be if they're going to be evading mankind for hundreds of years. I mean, these are not your animals that live in the woods. These are cognizant thinkers, and they have been theorized that they kind of they cover their tracks from time to time if they're in an area that they know that humans tend to frequent from time to time. They've been known to backtrack on their tracks, kind of throwing people off a little bit. But I will say this, they know they're being looked for. They know that people are out there in the woods hunting them. They're fully aware of that. And for that, they have to make that their number one top priority, which is to avoid humans at all costs.
Absolutely. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about your encounter and what your first experience with them firsthand was?
Yeah, sure. Basically, I don't really want to disclose the area right now because I still go up there for research, and we don't really want a whole crap ton of people going out there pushing the creatures out of the area. But
right,
I was in an area in 2013. It was the summer, and I was visiting an area doing research on the subject, and I was down there for 5 days. Now, I kept on going back to one particular mountain in general because I kept on hearing strange voice chatter coming from the woods at night, and I was asking myself, what is that? Because I could hear syllables. It sounded like a person talking in the woods, but the direction that it came from really didn't make any sense because it was just remote wilderness. I mean, there weren't any paths, there weren't any roads or trails or houses or cabins. It was just complete wilderness. And I flew a drone over there just a couple of years ago and just taken an aerial shot of the area, and there's just nothing but trees and wilderness out there. So anyways, jumping back to the incident, I was back there on the third night, and I'm just hanging out. I'm just walking around and this was probably around 12 12:30 is after midnight, and I heard the most god-awful scream. I mean, I can't even imitate the scream that I heard. Best way to describe it, it almost sounded like an elephant screaming and a woman screaming combined into two. I mean, the lung capacity on this thing was just sheer massive. And that kind of just stopped me in my tracks saying, what the F was that? At the time, I had a pistol, and I was wearing it on my hip, and I had my hand on my gun the entire time, and it sounded like a good distance away. And the ironic thing about the whole thing is that when that happened, all the crickets in the woods stopped. It's basically just everything went dead silent. And about a minute later, I heard the scream again, only a little bit closer. So I said to myself, well, I'm not sure what that is, but it's heading in my direction. So I got in my car, and I went down the road, because there was only one road up there and one road out. And I'm driving down the road, and I had all my windows rolled down, because after all, it was July. And I'm kind of sticking my head out, going, looking around, and I'm only going like maybe 5-10 miles an hour. And I get maybe a quarter of a mile down the road, and I come to a little bend in the road, and I see this obstruction off on the left side, driver's side of the road. And at first I thought it was a rock or a tree stump. I said to myself, geez, how the hell did that thing get there? That wasn't there when I came up here. And I'm saying, oh, great, I'm going to have to get out and move this thing out of the way so I can drive around it. Because the road was so narrow, the road was only wide enough for one car. So as I'm approaching it, as soon as my high beams hit it, this thing stood straight up. It took 2 strides across the road, and it was gone and into the woods. I mean, it was 1, 2, gone. And as I'm passing it, I could hear sticks and branches breaking as it's making its way into the woods. I didn't stop. I kept on going, and I get to the bottom of the mountain, and I pull off to the side because my hands were shaking and quivering so bad that I couldn't drive. I stopped, and I just sat there, which was probably maybe 4 or 5 minutes. To me, it seemed like an hour. And I just kind of had to, pull myself together mentally to tell myself, did I just see what I thought I just saw? Now, to describe what I saw, it was large in appearance. It was probably around 7.5, 8 feet in height. It was covered in hair. It was dark brown, almost a black in color. I never got to see its face because all I saw was a side profile view of it walking, making its way across the road. The legs on this thing were just so muscle-bound in appearance. I mean, I saw the muscles flexing in the legs as it walked across the road. It had kind of an arm swing to it. I mean, during that brief 2 seconds in time is just something you don't forget about. It had hands, and it just looked so human in appearance. If you can visualize a 8-foot tall Olympic power lifter that's covered in hair, that's really what you're going to get. And I didn't tell anyone about this for about 6 months, 7, 8 months maybe. First people I told were my parents, but I kept it to myself a lot of times, just simply because of the whole ridicule factor. So I eventually told someone, and a coworker, and he said, oh, someone was messing with you. Someone was playing a hoax on, playing a prank on you. And I laughed at them. I said, that's interesting, because I would really like to meet the person that was large enough to fill a costume that big. I said, you don't understand. You didn't see the sheer massive size of this thing. And the more you look at the whole prank factor, what kind of person do you know of that's about 8 feet in height that is going to hang out in the woods in a remote area in a costume like that, waiting for the off chance for someone to come along? And to take it one step further, nobody knew I was up there.
Right. I think a lot of people also, it's hard. I think they hear 7.5 to 8 feet, and I think a lot of people don't understand what that size actually looks like in person, and what that kind of mass would be for something like this. Just the impossibility of faking something like that, and seeing the muscle movement, and seeing, beyond that, just again, like you said, who's going to wait out in the middle of the woods, or in the middle of nowhere for what purpose are they? What did they get out of creating that amazing costume that almost nobody could possibly fill, just to give you a 2-second glance at something like that? So, can you? What did your body physically feel when you're finally seeing this thing that I guess, it's one thing to know that they're out there, or to think that they're out there, or to believe that they're out there, but to finally lay eyes on something that, everything that you've, that basically changes your world outlook in an instant. What is that like to experience that?
Well, I never not believed in them. I always knew they existed. The best way to describe physically what a person goes, or at least what I went through when I saw it, when you see something that stuns you to the point where you're just in shock, picture yourself as your blood turning to ice. You get that feeling, that nauseous feeling right when you're about to throw up. Your blood just becomes really cold. It's almost like you have ice in your veins. My heart was racing about 100 miles an hour. I thought my heart was going to just explode out of my chest. My hands were shaking. I had the shakes in my hands, and it's just, all of those physical features that come from a psychological experience such as that it's, some people would say that it's a traumatizing. I don't refer to it as traumatizing to me. I thought it was, to me, shocking, and to the point where I was actually moved by the whole experience, that this thing was standing right in front of me. This thing could have easily killed me if it wanted to, but I didn't get the impression that this thing wanted to harm me in any ways. So I'm not telling people to go out there and look for one and try and become friends with them, but they, for the most part, don't want anything to do with humans. Now, there has been some people reporting having some kind of interaction with them, to the point where their cabins get rocks thrown at them, and something is banging on the outside of their houses late at night. I think they're telling people that they don't want them there, but my theory behind that is that these are the juveniles that are, messing with people. I think the older creatures, they tend to know better, so they avoid humans. But I think these juvenile creatures are kind of like our teenage kids, in a sense, where they tend to be a little bit more mischievous. They'll throw rocks at people's houses just like we did when we were kids. They'll peek through people's windows. They'll kind of play pranks on people, in a sense. They'll run out in front of traffic. And these are the typical human behaviors that we exhibit when we're teenage kids, simply because we do things like that it's fun. It's fun to get a rise out of someone. Another
playful.
Yeah, in a sense, I think that they tend to be a little bit more mischievous. And
yeah.
And the reason why I suspect that the people are experiencing the juvenile Sasquatches is because when I asked them how tall was this thing, a lot of the times the reports are very consistent, where they're about 7.5 feet in height. Well, we know these things get taller; they get bigger. Than people have reported them seeing them 9 feet or even 10 feet in height. So that tells me that these are the more younger ones that are saying, "Hey, let's go bang on that guy's cabin tonight like we did last night. We'll scare the hell out of those people. Let's throw rocks at these hikers coming along, Let's run out in front of that car that's coming along, Because a good majority of the sightings we get are roadside sightings.
Right. Right. Can you tell us a little bit about maybe some of the more interesting or more exciting encounters that you've interviewed or heard about?
Yeah, actually, now that you mentioned it, I was just a few weeks ago. I was talking to a family just last year. They reached out to me. They reached out to me just about a month ago, but their encounter took place last year, the fall in October, and basically it went a little something like this. You have two brothers, a 13-year-old and a 15-year-old. They were going fishing. I'm not going to disclose the area because it's still ongoing. I'm still researching that area. So they were going up the way in a trail, making their way to a creek, and as they got a little ways up there, the younger brother of the two got pelted in the side of the ear with a little pebble. So he smacks his little brother, his older brother rather, and he says, "Hey, stop that!" You know, the kid's like, "What did I do? I didn't do anything." He goes, "You just threw a rock at me." He goes, "No, I didn't." And as he's doing that, he's facing his brother. He gets hit in the back of the shoulder with another rock, and he turns around and he looks at this particular tree, and it was the only tree that was fat enough in that direction for someone to hide behind. And they both looking at the same tree, and they're saying, "I think there's somebody here with us." So they start walking towards the tree and approaching it, and they're saying, "Hello, is somebody here? Who is that?" They get within, I'd say, maybe 30 yards of the tree when out steps this large, hairy, lumbering creature, and their description was it was over 7.5 feet, because the kid told me, he's like, "Well, my dad's 6'4", so this thing has to be at least a foot taller than him." And it was covered in hair. It was dark brown hair. Then they said it looked like a giant human. And I asked them, "Can you describe what the face looks like?" And they said, well, again, it had that conical-shaped head. They said the top of the head was pointed, and they said it had big black eyes like an owl. They couldn't see any whites in their eyes. And it said it had like a big, thick, brushy eyebrow, which to me looked like it would probably match the description of a pronounced brow ridge. The nose was flat, but it was wide, and it had large nostrils. It had thin lips, but wide. It had a square-looking jaw, no hair on the face, but it had sideburns. And one of the kids noticed it had a runny nose. So this thing is staring at them, and these kids are standing in front of it looking at it, and they said it was probably about 20 to 30 seconds, that this thing was standing there. And the kids said it was making growling sounds and pig snorting sounds at him, and I seem to think that's just the way it was breathing. And eventually this thing squatted down, kind of like a football player would do right before it blitzes after running into the field. Well, as this thing just squat down, these kids dropped their fishing poles and they ran down the path as fast as they could. And they got to the bottom of the trail, and they looked at each other. They're looking around, and they didn't see any sign of it. And the little brother said to his older brother, he goes, "Well, I got something to tell you. I just pissed in my pants." And the other brother goes, "Yeah, me too. So did I." And they walked back to it's kind of comical in a sense, but it's funny, but it's not, because these kids were genuinely scared after what they saw, and they went back and they're like, "Should we tell Dad? Should we tell Dad?" And his other brother goes, "No, don't tell Dad." And they told their mom, and the mom was like, "Well, where's your fishing poles?" And they're like, it's up in the woods. We're not going back after there to get it." So they eventually told their dad, and their dad was like, "Oh, Jesus, for heaven's sakes, I'm going to go up there and I'll find out." He didn't see anything, but eventually he retrieved the fishing poles. Now, how I learned about this story is the mother reached out to me through my Facebook page. Vermont Bigfoot Research Group is my page, and she told me the whole rundown of the story. Now, they didn't say anything over the holidays to the rest of their family, because they just wanted to keep the whole thing quiet, because they didn't want everyone to think that their losing
Crazy.
their mind or crazy or what have you. I mean, that's the common reaction you get from people these days. So the mother reached out to me recently and shared their story with me. Now, I actually went out there and I met the kids, and they took me up there, and they were kind of a little bit reluctant to do so, but I went up there. We were fully armed, so they showed me the exact tree where they saw it from, and I looked at them. I looked down the trail. I said, "Hey, kids, that's a good half a mile that you guys ran. Did you run the whole entire way?" And they're like, "Damn right we did."
Wow.
Now,
yeah.
Now again, we didn't find any footprints or anything because you're just not going to after all this time has passed. But
right.
The area in general, there was a creek nearby, and I do believe their story wholeheartedly because there's a lot of common denominators in that story that parallel other experiences, one of which there was kids involved. A lot of times when there's a Bigfoot sighting, there are children involved that end up having the encounter. Another one is that the sighting usually takes place 9 times out of 10, these sightings take place near bodies of water, swamps, ponds, rivers, creeks, lakes, that kind of thing, which makes perfect sense because they need water as a source to stay hydrated. And third one, most of all, is that it took place in the fall, which is here in New England. A lot of our sightings take place in the fall, like October, November, in that area, because my theory behind that is that when they're in your summer time, which is June, July, August, that I seem to think that they're more deeper into the woods because there's more vegetation, there's more to eat for them. So around October, when the vegetation is all died, that's the time where they tend to come out of their area. They kind of venture into our domain, and that's when people's pets wind up missing. That's when we see them going through dumpsters and ravishing people's garbage and things because they're foraging for food at that time of the year. So that's my personal theory.
Right.
Jason, for you've probably talked with, I don't know, a lot of people, I'll just say, and throughout interviewing people, have you gotten a few that you could tell were not really a real story versus a real story? Like some people will kind of just make up a story just so that they have a story. Have you ever came across any of yourself?
Yeah, about that. I have certain interview methods. I don't want to really give away all my secrets, but when someone tells me a story through a lot of times people contact me through email. I'll try and set up a phone interview with that person, and I'll ask them certain trick questions. Basically, I'm just trying to figure out if that person's lying to me or not. If I believe them, I'll try and set up a face-to-face interview where I actually meet them in person. Now, one thing I do is I ask them certain things over the phone. I'll ask them questions about, and basically it's all just a matter of paying attention to detail, and you ask them certain questions. Then when I meet them, I'm going to ask them those very same questions again and see if they kind of deviate from their original story, because if they do, well, that means that they're lying. And another thing you want to pay attention to when interviewing a person, it doesn't matter what the story is. If it's a really traumatic story that someone has been through, then you're going to notice some sort of body reaction. Sometimes the hair on their forearms stand up. Sometimes they shake. Sometimes, you're going to get all sorts of things. That tells me that the person was genuinely scared. So what I like to do is I kind of like to take them back to the time of their experience and get them to try and relive it just to see if they're being truthful or not.
Yeah, and sometimes, just like you were saying with the body language and stuff, that sometimes they will start shaking and quivering just because, it's like a nightmare to them if they've really been so impacted by it. And, I feel bad for those people, too, that have been traumatized. And you sometimes hear they have nightmares until they kind of talk about it. And talking about the experiences from what they've had seem to help out their fear, if I may say, or terror. Like, it helped them kind of settle down. And the last thing that I wanted to say too, before I forget, is going back to what we were talking about with Jason, with your experience with the whole, and also with what you just mentioned with the story of throwing rocks. You had also something similar yourself.
Yeah, and this was in a completely different area, where I've had rocks thrown at me in areas. Now, I don't want to just jump and point the finger at a Sasquatch and say he was the one who did it, because I'd never seen the perpetrator that did such. So, I kind of leave it in the category of the possibility where it could have been person, or it could have been something of the such. But again, I tend to live in a world of facts, so I don't really want to theorize as to what it could have been unless I actually have evidence that will actually support that.
Right. Oh, but going, just one thing I think that is important to say, I think for an audience, especially because, a topic like this, I think a lot of people, it's very hard for a lot of people to grasp this subject and sometimes the possibility that something like this can exist. But I think one thing that's hard for people to, I think, understand is this is not a subject that I think a lot of people, there's this idea that hoaxing or making up these stories brings some kind of, that there's something to gain from that. And obviously some people do lie and some people do make up stories, but would you find that there's probably a lot more motivation for people not to tell a story if they do experience it than the other way around? Have you found that, or would you agree with that, just from the ridicule and
you're right. You're absolutely right. The majority of the people that have had experiences in this field tend to kind of keep it quiet to themselves. And again, when people reach out to me, these are the small marginal percentages of people that actually feel comfortable about sharing it with someone, as opposed to most people. I mean, I've talked to people in general. I mean, I've talked to some coworkers, and I've known a couple of people who know someone who actually seen one of these creatures. And every year we have what's called the Paracon conference, which is they call it the Ghostacular. I'm usually there. I have my own table where people can come up to me and talk to me. And I get a lot of people that come up to me and tell me that they've heard something or seen something, or their grandfather saw a Bigfoot back in his day. And again, these people, you will not find their stories on any books or websites. And these are people that, like you said, they kept to themselves over these years because of probably their own personal fear of ridicule. People will think of that person as a crackpot. But then again,
right.
The whole cryptozoology field, unfortunately, has been looked upon as a crackpot science. And I hope to see someday where we can actually take Bigfoot out of the tabloids and bring it into the light of science, where it can actually be studied and seen and examined. But unfortunately, the only way to do that is with a body. Now, I don't want to be the one to pull the trigger, because I don't really like to kill anything out there in the wilderness. But unfortunately, the other side of the coin is, well, that's what it's going to take.
Right. And that's obviously, I think, maybe you could talk a little bit about the challenges of that on a couple levels. Have you done research? Obviously, there are a lot of reports of these things travel in groups, that they wouldn't be that easy. First of all, not just the size of them, but where you might be terrain-wise by the time you would take something out like that. The challenge of actually getting a body in, and then have you ever had any reports or any thoughts about any kind of interference once a body might have been taken or discovered?
Well, not too long ago, just some years back, I don't remember the exact year, there was a guy out in California who claims to have shot and killed one. I think he claims he shot two of them. I don't believe his story, because he had several variations of that story. Every time he told the story, he kind of deviated away from the original one. So But as far as the whole reality of the Sasquatch in their families, they've been known to travel in family units. And years ago, when I first got into it, I thought these were solitary creatures that traveled by themselves as lone wolves. But now I realize that that's not true. They do travel in families. They do travel in packs, but they tend to be a little bit more spaced out in the wilderness. They're a little further away from each other, so they can cover more ground. And I seem to think that that's mainly for hunting purposes. If you're a hunter, you probably are familiar with the term herding the deer, which is you're trying to get the deer to travel in a certain direction, where Big Daddy down the hill is there waiting for the deer, and they're basically herding them into the kill zone. Well, that's a method that some hunters use as well. So if you ever shoot a Bigfoot, well, you better watch out for the others, because I can almost guarantee you, bet your bottom dollar, there's at least 2 or 3 more in that area. You may not see them, but they're around there somewhere.
Right. Exactly.
Now that brings me an interesting question, Jason. Now, there's some, sorry, Alan, for cutting you out, but this is a very interesting topic because, we hear about people who shoot a Bigfoot because they're either charging them or whatever, and then you hear from people when they try to claim the body, I'll say, like the hunter trying to claim the body or whatever, another Bigfoot will come in and grab that dead Bigfoot body and then throw him over their shoulders and walk off with them. Now, I don't know if you have any type of thoughts on that, Jason, of what you think, why another Bigfoot would come over and claim one of their dead and walk off with it?
I've heard those stories before. That whereas hunters have been known to, shoot one before, and another one was seen in the area taking that one away and bringing it to safety. Well, that's probably a family member. I mean, if a member of your family got injured or hurt in the woods, I think your prime objective was to rescue that person and bring him into safety, away from the evil human that pulled the trigger on him, and that makes perfect sense. I can see exactly why they would do that. Now, if you were to shoot one and stop him dead in his tracks and he's just laying there, lifelessly, and you leave the area and say, well, I'll come back for it tomorrow when I can get a pickup truck or something big enough to carry it away, more than likely that thing's going to be gone. Now, if the family members of the Sasquatch is probably going to take it away somewhere, and we have this theory that's speculative only, is that we think that they bury their dead just like humans do. Now, if that creature that you shot was there all by himself, well, there's a good chance that you're going to be dealing with animal predation. There's going to be wolves, there's going to be coyotes, there's going to be other animals that will probably see that as a source of food, because when an animal goes down in the wilderness, all the rest of the animals know about it as well. So that's another challenge that you're going to be dealing with.
Not to mention their giant weight.
Yeah, I mean,
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say I don't recommend shooting these things, because they do tend to be they're human hybrids. So I think shooting one would be morally wrong. It would also be dangerous for the person with the gun, because now they're putting their own life at risk, because, well, like I said, you better watch out for the others.
Oh, that is very true. And and another thing, Jason, just real quick, is, we hear too with people that kill a Sasquatch, and then when they call the police or forest ranger or whoever and say, like, oh yeah, like I have a Bigfoot or whatever, did we hear about the police showing up with a unidentified car with black tainted windows, and then they just come in and say this never happened? Now, go ahead.
About that, there's been numerous people, not just here in New England, but there was an incident out in New York where a person actually claimed to have shot one, and he actually obtained tissue samples and hair samples from a piece of tissue that flew off of it as it took a hit from the side, and he actually put it in a plastic baggie, and he called the sheriff, and the sheriff came over and responded, and he he's like, well, I'll just take that and we'll take it in for analysis. And later on, I think it may have been a day later, he gets a visit from a black van with funny-looking antennas on the top of it, and guys getting out in, just civilian uniform clothing actually threatened him, and they threatened to throw him in jail. They threatened all sorts of bogus charges on that person should he go public with his statement.
Right.
So these stories are around where people are threatened by various rogue government agencies that they're not able to identify as to what branch of agency they're from, whether it's FBI or something else, but they know that they're being threatened because they have some sort of determining evidence that can actually prove the existence of these creatures, and it seems like that our government does not want that.
And,
right.
It's really scary when you think about that. And, I mean, I've heard of also stories where not only do they threaten to throw them in jail, but they threaten to, take away their property. And just to cover up the story and to use the location to, I guess, investigate their own terms, really. And it's really weird, too. And you brought up another interesting thing that I heard you say yourself, where you kind of found a hair some hair samples or fur samples, however you want to look at it, and you kind of had your own experience with that too, with finding this sample and trying to submit it yourself. But it's oh man, what would I I'm losing my train of thought here. Shit. Okay, well, I guess from right now is I know you had your own hair sample, Jason, and you tried submitting it. So can you tell us about
actually, that? Let me correct you on that. I did not submit it because, yes, I do have a hair sample that I obtained from a pricker bush in an area that was in Vermont, but I wasn't able to submit it to anyone because in order to submit it for DNA testing and analysis, well, unfortunately, it's expensive. It costs you a couple of $1,000s to do that. Now, I don't have the money to do that, so I've just kept them. I've kept it in a location this whole time, so I've yet to find someone that can actually do that for me.
There has been hair and DNA analyzed, and unfortunately, it seems that until they actually have the specimen on file, that they can actually they always go to it's tainted or it's inconclusive if it doesn't match. It's an unknown primate or close to human, or 98 or 99% human but unknown primate, and they don't and ultimately there's never the conclusive. They can never make the final conclusion until they actually have the specimen on file to actually
and yes, that is true.
Match it to.
That is true. There's a woman out there by the name of Melba Ketchum out in Texas. She has actually been through this whole DNA testing analysis, and she has had various research groups submit hair samples to her. She did not do the testing herself. She actually submitted it to other lab agencies out there. GenBanks was one of them, and they did the test. They did the procedure. They ran it back, and they've actually said, well, this came back human. They thought at first that there was maybe some cross-contamination. So she's like, well, that can't be. Can you run it again? They ran it back, and it came back as, well, no, these are human. Now, what they did was, so they said, okay, well, let's take it one step further. Instead of running the test on mitochondria DNA, which mitochondria, by the way, is only from your mother's side, they decided to test the nucleus of the DNA, which is both mother and father. Now, the test they got back then was a little bit different. They came back to be 90% human and 10% unknown. And that 10%, they were not able to match it with any species identification creatures on this planet. So we're theorizing that at one point in time, a human female breeded with an unknown that's probably now extinct, and now we have these hybrid species, which is known as the Sasquatches, which, by the way, we're all human hybrids. I mean, some of us have Denisovan DNA, others have Neanderthal DNA. So, all of us people, we're all human hybrids the way you look at it.
Right. And have you done any research into? I mean, there are countless stories of from Native Americans being kidnapped or taken, females or children taken away by wild men
there's a lot of stories behind that. I mean, depending on which Native American tribe culture you talk to, I guess some of them have actually said every single Native American culture on the North American continent gives some sort of reference to these creatures. Some of them say good things about them, some of them say bad things. Some of them call them the Elder Brothers, others call them the Mountain Devils. No matter how you slice it, they all know about them. They've known about them ever since before the white man even came to our continent and discovered America. Some tribes and cultures claim to have actually traded with them at some point in time. Some of them actually do not say nice things about them because some of them claim that some of their children were kidnapped by these creatures. Others say that their females were kidnapped, probably for breeding purposes. Whether or not they actually were able to actually give birth to any of their breeding is, I guess that's anyone's guess. I haven't not found any proof of that, but that's not to say it never happened.
Right. No, that's these tales definitely go back, and for sure it's amazing how many there's news articles from between the 1600s and the mid 1900s of wild men, and just after all the tales that were there. I know that a lot of the indigenous people said that these were actually the first ones, and that they were there even before they migrated to the areas. What's your thoughts for the skeptical audience? I mean, it's hard for a lot of people, I think, to understand how something this large and this and this massive, could remain hidden for so long. And I think a lot of people don't quite understand what our forests are like and what the terrain is like, and I think ultimately feel like we've covered a lot more ground.
We're not the only ones around. We're not the only ones.
Yeah. Well, as far as skeptics, I can understand the argument behind it, because after all, we don't have a body to show the general public and say, here you go. And I think the only way to solve this mystery and put it to rest is with a body. Now, as far as the whole general areas as to where these creatures breed and live and migrate, if you go on Google Earth Map and you look in some of these heavily forested areas, these areas are just huge. I mean, you're looking at hundreds of square miles that man has never even set foot on. And these are the really, really remote areas that are off the beaten track from areas that you won't find any roads nearby, that you won't find any hiking trails nearby. These are the areas that you really want to look in to find these creatures. Unfortunately, most people don't venture out into those remote areas. And that's part of the problem as to why we haven't really found any of these creatures. Another reason is that there's so few of them spread so far thin beyond our vast wilderness. Now, there's a lot of theories that a lot of these cryptozoologist people out there, they say there's between maybe 4,000 to 7,000 of them here in the U.S. I kind of disagree with that personally. I think those numbers are relatively low. In order to sustain an adequate breeding population, you're going to need the numbers to be a little bit higher than that. So I'm going to go on record. I'm going to say anywhere between 15,000 to 18,000 of them here in the North American continent, including Canada. Now, I think if the numbers were any higher than that, they would be seen more often. But again, those numbers are not that high, because when you consider the Vermont Fish and Wildlife estimated there to be about 5,000 bears in Vermont. Okay, Where are they? How come we're not seeing them as often?
Exactly.
You see my point?
Right, and I think the other thing is people don't realize how rare it is to find those bones and bodies in the wilderness. And beyond that, a creature like Sasquatch, for what it is, seems to be the master of this kind of terrain, and we just are not. And our ability to sort of navigate these areas and right, they're aware of us well before we would be aware, come anywhere near being aware of them.
Exactly. These things are masters of their environment. They grew up in the woods. They live in the woods. Now, you can take, I don't know if you ever watched the History Channel, if you ever watch a documentary on the Green Berets. These are our military's elite special forces. They can camo themselves up to the point where if you're in the woods, they will stand, you will be 3 feet away from one of these dudes, and you will never even know they're there. That's how they can blend themselves in. Now, these creatures are, again, masters of their environment. So they grew up in the woods, and they know the area a lot better than any of us humans do. And when people take a walk in the woods, they have no idea how vast the wilderness is in there. I mean, there's a reason why we call it the wildlife.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
And we're also, we tend to be pretty clumsy.
We are.
And make a lot of noise, and these things do not.
In fact, they will see you, hear you, and smell you before you even know that they're around.
Absolutely.
Their senses are a lot more acute than ours. I mean, if you had a skull of a Sasquatch, I'm going to theorize and say that the nasal cavity of their skull is a lot larger than our human skull, so that means their nasal passages are a lot more sensitive than us humans. Their eye sockets are probably going to be a lot bigger, which allows them to take in more light, which gives them more night vision ability. Their hearing senses are probably a lot more attuned than the average human. So again, I think they may be a pay grade above us as far as genetics is concerned. They're just far more superior than us humans.
I want to touch on what Jason was saying too about how a Bigfoot would hear, smell, and stuff before we would see it. Now, Jason, what about those that get told, like, I was in the woods and I somehow was able to sneak up on this Bigfoot? How would a Bigfoot allow a human to sneak up on them? Is it because the Bigfoot allowed the human or the hunter to sneak up on them?
I guess it all depends on the whole scenario of the story. There are a possibility that a lot of them people are just storytellers and they're just kind of yanking their chain a little bit there. There's always going to be those hoaxers. With all the currency $20 bills we got out there in circulation, there's a few counterfeit ones out there too. So that's something you need to be aware of. And as far as someone actually sneaking up on one, I guess you look at the area and topography of the area. Was it near a stream where the river was flowing so loud that it was actually drowning out any sound? Was the wind blowing in the direction that was against their favor? These are all certain variables that you need to consider. Maybe the thing just wasn't paying attention because, after all, they're human too. They make mistakes just like us people do. So,
I think a lot of times I think a lot of times also you hear maybe that it might be a hunter in a tree stand or in an area where these things are hunting and focused on the prey, and they might wander into the area focused on their target. Or other times you might hear that they're standing there. They did have the human fooled, but maybe they either moved 1 second too soon and the human caught them out of their peripheral, or maybe they're holding a juvenile and the juvenile gives them away. But they're capable of standing so perfectly still and seeming so camouflage with their environment.
And about that, a lot of times we get hunters telling stories about them being up in deer stands and having sightings of these creatures. That actually makes a lot of sense, because when you're that high in elevation, you really are getting your scent up off the ground where they can no longer smell you anymore. And if you're sitting there in your deer stand and you're completely motionless, you're not making any noise, well, they're probably not going to hear you. And if you're really camoed up and you're camouflaged into that tree, well, there's a good chance they might not even see you. Now, when they tell stories of this creature, well, it walked right past me, well, either A, it knew you were there and just didn't give a shit about you, or B, maybe you actually did pull that one off and they didn't even know you were there. So, there's different possibilities behind that. So sure, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think so. And I think also sometimes they are tracking the human, and, they might be either curious or just wanting to make sure that they follow the person to make sure that they've either left their territory, and there can be missteps in that way as well. So I think it's, ultimately though, for the most part, it seems pretty hard to pull one over on these things. And they seem to have a good idea of the distances to stay from people and how to sort of avoid, that is like you said before, this is a part of their survival. So, their survival, is all about, not getting caught by us and not getting, and not letting us get onto them. So, did you want to touch on some of the, I'm sorry.
Well,
were you going to say something there? Yeah.
I was going to say, Alex, I'll touch on what you were kind of getting at for a minute. It was, we got to think of it like this, where if we can somehow creep up on a Bigfoot, whether like what Jason was saying, like how loud was like maybe a river or the water flowing or the wind or something that would make the Bigfoot not hear us coming, but also we got to look at how ancient are these things, how much knowledge is there, because they got to be wicked intelligent to the point where can humans like us even outsmart something like Bigfoot? No, we cannot. We can't even come close to it. And it's just one of those things of how much knowledge does one of these type of things or creatures have.
Right, and how arrogant are we to think that we already have the knowledge of everything that's out there? There's an element of arrogance on our end, especially people, to think that we've mastered everything and that we know about everything and that there's nothing left to discover.
Yeah, exactly. And as a part of that is that humans and scientists are so arrogant. They think that a piece of paper that tells them they have a 6-year, 8-year degree or what have you, they think that they have all the answers and they know everything there is to know. Well, I'm calling bullshit on those guys because you look at the giant squid. Everyone thought they existed only in Hollywood until one of them washed up on shore. You have the giant coelacanth fish, which was thought to be extinct millions of years ago until a fisherman caught one off the coast of South Africa back in the 1930s. We don't even know what's on the bottom of our ocean floor, and yet they're going to say we know everything that lives in our woods. No, consider this. Science is still in its infancy age. If I was to put an age on it, I would say science is the equivalent to a 5-year-old kid these days. There's so many things out there that we just have not discovered yet, and we don't know. And it's foolish, arrogant, and stupid all rolled into one for someone to come along and say, no, they don't exist. If they did, we would have had one by now. Well, I think that time is coming. It's just a matter of when and where. You look at the giant great white shark. For years we knew they existed. We've had video footage of it, and, Jaws kind of made you afraid of going into the water, but for years we were not able to capture one because of their sheer size. Well, now we do have them. So, with Bigfoot, right, we're just not there. We're not there just yet. But there will be a day where that will happen.
Sorry to cut you off, but yeah, even going another step is the story about the panda, which was, that was an animal that was incredibly elusive for no good reason other than the fact that we couldn't get to it. There was no good reason, like a panda that's not remotely as intelligent or as hard to spot as a creature like this.
Absolutely. And, when you're dealing with the panda bears, not to insult their species, but they're as stupid as a bag of hammers. And they're not evading humans. They're just living their lives as panda bears. It took 60 years for a research group to capture one and bring it into public and say, they do exist, here you go. the first research group gave up after 30 years, and they called it quits when their second generation kicked in, and they said, we'll take over from here. And eventually they captured one. Now, what does this all prove? It proves that us humans, we cannot hack it in their environment. We can't live in the woods without our medical equipment. We can't live in the woods without the daily necessities that we have today. We can't do that. Now, today, with our technology, can we capture a panda bear in the woods? Absolutely. Nowadays, we have helicopters, we have thermal imaging cameras, we have elite military groups that are more trained and more advanced in weaponry and more hunting abilities. We know a lot more than we did back in the 1800s. But back then, that just proves that humans cannot live in their environment indefinitely, and the panda bear has actually proved it to us.
Absolutely, yeah. And taking one more step is that our scientists seem to refuse to look at the evidence that is there. There's overwhelming amounts of evidence currently that could help classify the species as is, and there seems to be a global refusal to just even look at it. They're not acknowledging the evidence. They're not debunking it. They're just not acknowledging it.
No, because it's basically sheer ignorance. And I can understand up to a certain point, because if you look at the Bigfoot world is basically a world full of hate where everyone is totally fighting against each other, and there's always these people that call themselves researchers, or they're always out to belittle one another, and it's easy to say something negative about someone, and it's hard to say something about them positive, and these attacks are endless. And when a scientist comes along and sees all of that stuff from the outside in, why would they want to get involved? I don't blame them.
Right, it's true. Although it's shocking to me that someone like Jeff Meldrum could be ignored for as long as he is, or Bender Nagel, like people like that who just it amazes me that men as respected as that could have the scientific world sort of just snicker at them and act like these guys they clearly know what they're talking about. But they're treated, and are respected in so many senses up until you get to the topic, where then they're just sort of a shrug and that's just sort of their little idiosyncrasy, their little quirk. It's a bizarre thing, and so yeah, it's.
Yeah, I give those guys a lot of credit, because they actually risk their own reputations by stepping forward and going public and saying these creatures do exist. Here's the evidence to prove it. And Jeff Meldrum is another one. People, they said, "Wow, really?" And the guy, I think his name was Grover Krantz. He passed away back in the early '90s. He ruined his own reputation by coming forward and saying that these creatures exist, basically just by simply presenting the truth to the general public. He lost his job eventually at one point because of that. And, so now, people are a little bit more in tune with that.
Afraid.
Whereas, nowadays it's not so bad anymore, because we're starting to come together and people are starting to actually have more of an open mind and saying, well, maybe these things do exist. I mean, there's all of these people coming out and presenting all sorts of evidence. We have everything else out there except a body. So maybe some of this does look to our favor, that we should, investigate the matters most. Now, a lot of these scientists, believe it or not, will not actually tell you that they believe in it. They will not confirm anything, but behind closed doors, they actually do research these things on their own.
Right.
So that's something to keep in mind.
Right. Well, I mean, it's hard to imagine anybody with any level of intelligence looking at the actual evidence that exists today and denying and saying that this all could have been hoax, that this number of credible witnesses, this number of footprints, that even the Patterson-Gimlin film that has never been and can't be debunked, because if you look at it, there's no possibility that could have been hoax. It's just that these things that that there is, there's overwhelming, and there is hair and DNA, and scat and flood that exists, and there's just an unwillingness to classify it, and until they're forced to. But like you said, and the scientific community laughed at the idea of a panda. They laughed at the idea of a gorilla. They laughed, until they were forced to acknowledge it.
And that's what's going to keep going on with this subject until somebody brings one out to the public. We're going to laugh about it and call us crazy until we actually literally bring it into the light and say, yes, look, these exist.
Yeah, and I think that, until that happens, people are still going to continue to make jokes about it. They're still going to be, printing tabloid magazine issues of it, and there's still going to be, all sorts of crazy people saying that I gave birth to Bigfoot's baby, or they have their, all sorts of crazy nonsense out there. So we need to really take matters seriously and start investigating it. But like I said, and I keep on saying this, the only way it's going to solve this mystery is with a body.
Can you touch a little bit on, you do have a portion of your book that does look into the other crypto phenomena, if you will. What is your take on some of the non-Sasquatch? Because it's I think for those who may be on the line or who believe, not necessarily know, but believe in Sasquatch based off of evidence, it might be harder to sort of wrap their heads around some of the other sightings and reports and of some of the phenomena out there. Can you touch on some of that?
Well, one of the creatures that I mentioned in the book was the infamous champ monster in our lake. That we've been theorizing that it's nothing more than just a plesiosaur. Now, there are people out there that, again, they're not going to believe it, and that's fine, all well and good. But when we look at the evidence and we look at the sightings and when we talk to the eyewitness people that describe these creatures, it sounds to me like it matches that description of a plesiosaur, which is a amphibious dinosaur that actually once roamed the earth. Now, the question in general is, how did something like that survive the Ice Age when all the rest of the large mammals died off? Well, the answer to that is this was a water animal. The land animals are the ones that perished and didn't survive. Now, somewhere around 65 million years, something hit our planet and caused a large, long-term ice age. Now, if you look at any kind of marine life, such as sharks, alligators, they've been around since the dinosaurs, and they survived simply because they're water animals. There are certain bird species that we've figured out that survived the Great Ice Age too. So, there are animals out there that did survive that. Now, this creature champ, we think that it may have evolved over the years, and now it has the ability for echolocation. Now, we thought only dolphins had that ability. Well, we're starting to think that maybe this creature does too. So that's an example of that. Another species I talked about in the book was Thunderbirds. Basically they're just large birds. Now, that's not necessarily to say that these were pterodactyls, but I think that they are large birds because the large California condor bird had a wingspan of over 12 feet. So, is there a bird out there that's larger than that? Well, that could very well be. I'm not going to say there is or there isn't, but I'm just keeping an open mind as that the possibilities are out there.
See, and that's what I'd see. You just brought up the most perfect thing right there, Jason. Is open mind. You have an open mind to think that there's these things or creatures are out there where others can't even accept the fact that there could be things beyond what they already know. And once you bring something that they swear should not even exist to their attention, and if they see it, they can't believe it. Like, they can't even accept it or anything. You've got to have an open mind because we really know what else to talk about.
And I can't stress that enough, because when dealing with the unknown topic, you really, really need to keep an open mind, because just when you close your mind and you think you know everything, that's right around the time when you really don't know much of anything. And when I got into the whole crypto case, I had a person tell me, he's a respectable crypto person, he said, the more you know, the less you'll understand. And I think he actually hit the bullseye on the target with that one.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately, listeners, this is where the interview has to stop for right now for part 1. Unfortunately, Jason ended up disconnecting due to cell phone service, but he will be back for part 2. This is not over, and we probably could have talked for another hour. There's so much we can talk about with this type of category. We were gonna go into some Dogman, so stay tuned for part 2 as we talk about the infamous Dogman and more about his book and upcoming project that Jason can share and story. So I hope you will stick around and enjoy what we have to offer you next time. And until then, stay scary, everybody.